This episode is about components of emotions. Hi, Professor Emotion here. Today we're going to be talking about the components of emotion. But before we get there, it's probably important to ask one significant question. What is an emotion? Turns out that question is actually really difficult to answer. In fact, people who study emotion don't have a clear definition of what emotion is. There have been a couple of surveys done of emotion researchers where someone's asked, hey, how would you define an emotion? What do you think an emotion is? And what happens is there's a lot of different answers. So there's not one clear definition of what an emotion is. But there are some things that emotion researchers agree on, and that's these components of emotion. Essentially, researchers agree that emotions tend to have several key features that together make up an emotional episode. What are those components of emotion? Well, the 5 main components that we are going to talk about are subjective feeling state, physical sensations, thoughts, action urges, and expression. 5 main components, like 5 fingers in a hand, which can help you remember them. The first is the subjective feeling state. This is basically when someone asks what you're feeling and you tune in inside, this is your response. So this tends to be how people might label or categorize what it is that they're feeling. Some people get super specific about what they're feeling and they might say, I'm a tad embarrassed, but a little excited and kind of a little bit nervous too. Other people might just say, I'm feeling bad. Neither of those are inherently bad or good, and we'll talk about that at some point as well. Basically, the subjective feeling state is that sort of coalescing into you are feeling an emotion. The second component of emotion is the physical sensations. This is what's happening in your body during an emotional episode. Internal sensations can be things like heart racing or stomach distress. The word internal here basically means that they're happening inside the body so that no one else can see them. External things are also happening in the body, but they're visible to the external eye. So sweaty palms, getting super jittery, your eyes splitting around, getting watery eyes, which kind of means crying. Those things are external, but they're also physical sensations that may go along with emotion. The third component are thoughts. Thoughts are really important to emotions. When an emotional event happens, we tend to have a response to it. We think about it. And that thinking has something to do with the emotion that we experience. So it's hard to sort of decide what thoughts go with what emotion. Instead, I ask, what kinds of thoughts do you have in different emotional states? We do tend to think a little bit differently when we're experiencing a strong emotion versus when we're just walking around living our everyday lives. The fourth component of emotion are action urges. This is a pretty neat component. It basically means that different kinds of emotions are associated with different bodily urges to do things. So certain emotions prompt us to do stuff. And these are urges. This doesn't mean that we actually engage in the behavior. So when people are mad, it tends to prompt an action urge to approach or attack. It doesn't mean that we're going to throw a plate against the wall or we're going to punch someone in the face, but the emotion has that urge that goes along with it. Sadness tends to urge us to seek support and comfort. Anxiety and fear tend to urge us to run away. Different emotions tend to be associated with different action urges. So when you experience an emotion, I encourage you to think about, what do you want to do? Finally, the last component of emotion is expression. Expression is how we show emotions to other people. These are facial expressions and body language that signal our emotional states. Some people tend to be pretty obvious about what they're experiencing. Their emotions show up in their body language and on their face. Other people tend to be a little bit less expressive, hold their emotions closer to the chest. Vest? It's a weird phrase. Anyway, expression is one additional component of emotion. Now, if you're asking, are there really only 5 components of emotion, Professor Emotion? No, of course not. There are definitely more than 5 components of emotion. Those are the 5 that researchers have agreed on. in addition to emotions being situated in the brain. We know there are different brain regions that are associated with emotion and different neurotransmitters or signals that have to do with emotion. However, I'm not talking about those as much here because we don't have great access to knowing that our amygdala happens to be lit up or that serotonin isn't functioning properly. The 5 components that I'm focusing on are things that you can actually notice within yourself and in other people, at least if you ask them. So those are the 5 things that we are going to focus on in this video series. Remember, these 5 components of emotion work together. There's a reason that we use the hand as a way to discuss the 5 components of emotion. They're kind of all interconnected. So if all of these exist for a given emotion, even if we don't necessarily know what our subjective feeling state is, it doesn't mean these ones aren't going on, because they are. Sometimes these emotional components, different people have different levels of awareness of each one. Me, for example, I really rely on that physical sensations component to know that I'm experiencing an emotion. I might be busy doing something and sort of realize that I feel kind of tense and that I have a bit of a knot in my stomach. And I might have to stop and say, wait a second, am I sick? Am I hungry? Or, oh, I'm anxious. And pull those other pieces actually together. So different people vary in how aware they are of the different components, but everybody does have these components. They are sort of universal to emotions. There's a subjective feeling piece, a physical sensation piece, a thought piece, an action urge piece, which really goes along with emotion more so than mood. And we have a piece about expression. These 5 components together make up an emotion. Even though researchers don't really agree on the definition of emotion, they do agree that emotions include these parts.